There was never a world in which we had a perfect vaccine acceptance rate, in which the entirety of the United States had the right response and wanted to get vaccinated.
The kinds of conversations, just for flavor, that people are having in these episodes people are concerned about aren't like don't get vaxxed conversations. They are more on the lines of, why aren't more people talking about X or Y study?
These people are using his platform to kind of spin him, and they're clearly spinning him.
There are people who said, they heard I was going to have Andrew Sullivan on the show, and they say, oh my God, why would you platform Andrew Sullivan? My view is Andrew Sullivan has a platform that's so much bigger than my own, including, by the way, for years in traditional media. I felt like I had a personal obligation to be prepared to read what he's written, to be familiar with his arguments and be ready to rebut. But there's always the chance that he could have bested me in that interview and I could have been spreading whatever people's critique of him is. All right, I have assembled an all-star panel this week to discuss the news item of the moment, the attempted cancellation, as it were, of Joe Rogan off the Spotify platform following 2 interviews in particular with guests who've been accused of COVID misinformation. Here to discuss today, we have returning to the podcast, Freddie DeBoer of the popular Substack, the Freddie DeBoer Substack. Welcome, Freddie.
Hi.
For the first time on Bad Faith Podcast, Evan Greer, who is a musician and director of Fight for the Future. Welcome, Evan.
Thanks for having me.
And Taylor Lorenz, New York Times reporter on culture and tech, recently announced that she's going to be scooped by the Washington Post. Congratulations. Welcome to Washington, D.C. How are you doing, Taylor?
I'm staying in L.A., but I'm good.
No, I saw on Twitter that you said you would be making some frequent trips to Washington, D.C., and I'm going to hold you to it because I need some company. First and foremost, I want to take the temperature of how people are feeling about this. Evan, I reached out to you because I saw you specifically tweeting about the fact that not enough people were talking about this and covering this who had a background in the area. Specifically, you tweeted, "Hi, producers. I'm a digital rights expert who has worked extensively on issues of content moderation and big tech regulation, and also a professional musician who literally put out an album called Spotify is Surveillance. You don't need to book some rando professor for your segment. What are we missing here? Can you just start by laying out the broad contours of what this controversy is and what people are missing?"
Yeah, for sure. And I love when people read my tweets back to me because I'm like, oh, did I tweet that? I really did. But, I think there's just so many different elements to this. And I think there's a lot of pieces that are getting kind of glossed over. So first and foremost, I would actually argue that in some ways, this isn't one of those big, thorny content moderation controversies that, I was maybe referencing because, Joe Rogan is not just being hosted by Spotify, they're actually paying him, right? So in a lot of ways, this is more similar to, the Washington Post hiring someone and people wanting to create controversy around it. Or, Neil Young saying, I don't want to perform on stage next to so-and-so. So either I'm dropping from this festival or, you have to boot them, right? So I'd argue it's more similar to that when you actually look at the, mechanics of what's going on. But I'm not sure that most people who are kind of cheering this on are recognizing that distinction. And so I do think that this is related to a kind of broader cultural shift where people do essentially want to see voices that they disagree with or that they think are harmful silenced or booted from popular platforms. I think the other piece that's frustrating for me is that there have been musicians calling out Spotify for a wide range of other harmful practices. The Union of Musicians and Allied Workers have been pushing for Spotify to just pay independent musicians more fairly for like more than a year since the beginning of the start of the pandemic. My organization, Fight for the Future, organized a campaign around a patent that Spotify filed to literally listen to your conversations and use voice recognition surveillance software to algorithmically recommend music to you, right? So there's a lot of ways that Spotify's business practices are really harmful. And it's just sort of weird to me that there's been this kind of tempest in a teapot around this one specific podcast. But again, I'm not sure that when you really look closely at it, there's necessarily any huge thorny content moderation issues at play, because really this is a publisher and someone saying, I don't want you to publish my music while you're publishing this thing that I disagree with.
Well, Taylor, you've covered issues like this a lot in the past. Do you think this is a tempest in a teapot? Do you think that that distinction that Evan made is a distinction without a difference? Is there something specific here about this Joe Rogan scenario that makes it different from some of the other conversations that have been had about whether or not Parler, for instance, which was the conservative, well, it was invented, it was created ostensibly as a neutral alternative to other kinds of platforms like Twitter and Substack. However, it was used in large part early on in the initial stages by more conservative folks who had been booted off in the Trump era of those other mainstream platforms. Is this similar in that conversation, or is there something distinct here that makes it different?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Evan in the fact that it's fundamentally different in so many ways. It is much more, I mean, they paid him, $100 million and to sort of publish and create exclusive content for Spotify, they're licensing his stuff. So I think that it reminds me a lot of a publisher hiring somebody that they find distasteful or running an op-ed that people disagree with. And then, other people pulling out or voicing their concern. So I think it's interesting because at the same time, Spotify is like this tech platform that people sort of think of. And I think there's this added element of the artists, which they're also beholden to. So I think probably no one's really canceling. I mean, maybe some people are canceling Spotify, but ultimately, like, they're a subscription supported business that relies on music. And I think if Taylor Swift or some bigger artist was to get involved, like, then that might change the dynamics of things right now. But for the time being, it's kind of like people are mad at this publishing deal. It's very different than just like user generated content. That said, I think the reason that this like has taken hold so much as like a thing in culture is because it's adjacent enough to those bigger conversations that are only going to get more, relevant over time.
So would you say this is analogous to something like the recent Dave Chappelle scandal where, people said they were going to cancel their Netflix subscriptions? There were protests of employees and outsiders also at Netflix. Ultimately, that seems to have blown over. I don't know if it's really changed anything in terms of Netflix's ability to earn money or change their incentives in terms of, again, hiring guests or booking artists like Dave Chappelle to do specials for their channel.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't know what everyone else thinks. I think that's probably a much better correlation than kind of like the content moderation, like stuff that we're talking about. And I mean, look, these companies have shown that they want to make money, right? That's the whole goal. So they are going to continue to work with Chappelle. They are going to continue to work with Rogan because they have these extremely dedicated fan bases, and they'll stop doing that when it becomes financially not viable. And so far, we have not seen enough of a like backlash to these things to really put a dent in any of these big companies.
Well, Freddie, is there a problem here? At the end of the day, if Neil Young and Joni Mitchell are joined by people with huge, who make Spotify a lot of money, like Taylor Swift, and pull out, and Spotify is forced to make a decision between whether it wants to host people like Joe Rogan versus people like Taylor Swift, and the consumer voices their preferences, and Spotify makes a decision. Is that ultimately a problem? Is it a free speech problem the way it's being characterized now?
Well, I don't think it's a problem for me if those people want to do that and apply their market power to pressuring Spotify to do that. But if you are someone who is among those who genuinely want the misinformation or whatever to be shut down, then it actually is a problem for you because, of course, Joe Rogan will always find a place to host whoever he wants. I mean, I often am brought on to things to sort of have a sort of civil libertarian perspective, but more and more often I just feel like it's kind of pointless because the debates are always preempted by technology, right? There's always going to be somewhere that you can find that you can find some Russian server farm somewhere, right? And you can set yourself up. He's still going to have, an audience in the tens of millions. And I'm sure his deal had some pretty significant penalties in it for Spotify, financial penalties if they didn't honor the length of the contract. I mean, the comparison I always make is, ISIS, like the Islamic State. Mm-hmm. When they were the most wanted terrorist organization in the world, and the entire weight of all the establishment governments in the world and the defense apparatus, the intelligence agencies, everyone was out to get them. They had a glossy magazine that they published. They ran recipes and interviews and Q&As and film reviews, right? Like they were able to have this incredible messaging apparatus at the exact same time that all of the establishment governments in the world were trying to destroy them, right? Because in the internet age, there's just no such thing as actually silencing anybody. And so if you think about it in terms of if your goal is to actually shut up Joe Rogan, you can move him off of Spotify. It will burnish his bad boy cred with all of his biggest fans, right? They'll be able to find him someplace else. People will still flock to go to his show. He'll still have an audience in the millions. And so it's unclear sort of what you're accomplishing. I mean, one thing I try to remind people of is, Germany and France, for example, have the kind of sort of strong anti-hate speech and anti-far-right ideology laws that a lot of American liberals would like for us to have. The most important thing to know about those laws is that they don't work, right? Like what happens in France and in Germany is when they shut down one of these parties, they dissolve and they reform under another name. When they ban a slogan, they get a new slogan. When they ban an insignia, they come up with a new insignia, right? Like you can't attack the problem at the root. And if it was ever possible to actually impede the flow of information, it's certainly not in the internet age. And so at some point, look, like if Spotify thinks that it's in its best interest to get Joe Rogan off of its platform, that is not a free speech issue in the traditional sense, because again, Joe Rogan is going to find some place to broadcast his message. But if you are someone who thinks that you need to shut down Joe Rogan specifically to impede his ability to disseminate this information, then you basically have nowhere to go because he's always going to find some place to be able to do that.
Well, some people have made this argument that, this isn't a free speech issue because it's commercial speech and, Spotify can do it at once. And then other people point out that the issue is that, there's precedent for saying that the government can't coerce providers or publishers or what have you into limiting speech. It still constitutes the same kind of coercive effect as you would have. And basically everything is privatized at this point at some way or other. So it really kind of misses the forest for the trees there. I take your point, Freddie, that, in the internet age in particular, someone always has a place to go. Is that an argument, though, for people who might have a legitimate incentive to curtailing certain kinds of misinformation, as it were? And we're going to get to substantively whether that's what's going on here. But does that mean that we flatly believe that there should be no effort to curtail any kind of, whether it's hate speech or other kinds of non-prohibited speech via these kinds of platforms?
Just like a lens to think about that is the fact that, like, whether or not it actually functions as a meaningful constraint on speech depends upon your pre-existing level of power, exposure, and money, right? In other words, it's much harder to impinge the free speech of Joe Rogan than it is of some rando on Twitter, right? Where if you remove his platform that rando on Twitter, then no one is going to come seek them out in a different format. And so there's a weird, perverse way in which a lot of this stuff ultimately ends up further empowering people who already are in a position of power.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Taylor, because I know that you've written on this issue before. I mean, do you think that, let's say, a Parler springs up to meet the needs of folks who feel like they haven't been able to express themselves fully on another app? We can imagine that there is a left version of Parler, and again, Parler didn't present itself as being a right-wing app. The Canadian founder articulated that it was going to be neutral, but it happened to be used predominantly by people who are more conservative in nature because of the valence of the censorship that was happening on the mainstream apps, right? So, if something like that were to happen again, let's say that was accommodating a left flank, would we feel as sanguine about it getting shut down or, squeezed in the way that it was in the Trump era?
Yeah. Are you talking about Parler or the
Parler?
Yeah, I think Parler is an interesting case because it's so funny when all of these tech people, they start these platforms and then it's really the users that define the platforms, not the other way around. And so I think that if you've cultivated a very specific user base, you need to think about why your platform is cultivating that user base and kind of make adjustments. And clearly, if you have a user base, maybe that means leaning into it, maybe it means not. But I'm trying to figure out, is the question, should those things exist or should we be worried about?
Because I can see an argument that the Parler's user base was defined in part because of the kind of censorship or whatever you want to call it that people were experiencing on the mainstream apps?
I think that there's a narrative around that I haven't seen it happen as much, really. Like, I think a lot of that, especially the average users, of course, there's these powerful people that yes, are going to get themselves kicked off by violating terms, right? And might end up on a parlor, and those influencers are going to be there. And so the fans will follow, but the fans themselves aren't really experiencing censorship on those mainstream apps. So it really becomes a place to kind of engage with those influencers. I think we're always going to have apps like that. Like, I kind of agree with Freddie in the sense that, like, if you close down one app, like, you might have another, but I think I don't think that means that, like, Twitter should just be a free for all. I think it's about curating communities and allowing users to kind of, like, spend time in places that they want, right? If a ton of terrible people want to spend time together in an app and they're not being problematic, or they're just kind of, like, hanging out, I don't think that's a problem. If they're using it to plan violence or whatever, right, then it becomes a problem. And I think that's what, like, apps like Discord, right, have had to struggle with, or Parler, or whatever.
So this is the fundamental issue, right? What constitutes being problematic? And, who it is that's actually doing the censorship. I mean, we're in a place where, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg have, kind of acknowledged that they are playing the role, a bigger role, because of the reach of their platform. And the government is ultimately playing and making these kinds of decisions about what kinds of speech are valid and acceptable. And go ahead, Taylor.
I was just going to say, I think that's why we're seeing the move towards things like Discord, where you can actually curate your own sort of communities. Like, people seem to be moving into these areas and these platforms that allow for great customization. And, like, that way, like, they know, like, hey, look, this is a free for all insane community, or on this community, these are the rules. And it is more explicit, because I think you're right. I think, like, the big tech platforms have done such a messy job of all of this that I think people want those. They want to understand the rules of the game. You know what I mean?
For people who don't know what a Discord is, I confess we had a bad faith Discord for a while, and I honestly I don't truly understand. Like, I've been in it. I've been in them before, but, like, what is Discord?
Sure. And Evan, I feel like feel free to chime in too, or Freddie. I'm talking so much.
I got lots on all this, but you should explain what Discord is.
Yeah, Discord, I mean, a lot of media people are more familiar with Slack. It's sort of similar to Slack. It's almost a super hyper customizable kind of, like, community tool. So it's almost like a hybrid group chat, social network kind of thing. It's it's basically like a Slack. You have your different rooms or communities, you have main feeds, but you can customize it so much. Like, you can kind of build your own. It's like Lego blocks for building your own little community. And so I think people really like that. People really like to be like, look, I'm in this Discord. I know the rules of the game, right? I'm not just going on Twitter and I don't know if what I'm going to say is going to get, deleted or not, or there's these really unclear terms. So it's kind of taking, like, forum culture, like Reddit, right? It's very clear about, like, what's acceptable in certain subreddits, and, like, sort of applying that to a more social framework. I really do think that's where we're going.
So it does seem to me, though, and I'll go to you for this, Evan. It does seem like part of what the appeal is with Joe Rogan, and I think a lot of people who are very upset in this moment perhaps don't really have a good sense of what the show is like if you actually listen to it, because it does seem like the whole charm of it, if you will, is that Joe Rogan doesn't pretend to be an expert. He has this very everyman persona. He has these sprawling 3-hour interviews where the topic meanders, and he's able to just ask all the follow-up questions that a normal person would ask if you were sitting across from, a biophysicist, or, a astronaut, or a gymnast, or whatever it is, when you're not an expert in their field. And there's something that can be really accessible about those interviews because they are long enough to have the space to get all the information out. And also, he's asking basic questions that don't assume a lot of knowledge. And he's had an enormous amount of success and has this huge audience because of that approach. And so there's something to me that seems like it resists. The whole point of Joe Rogan is that it resists that kind of more intimate, self-curated world of Discord. It's about a bunch of everyday people saying, oh, look, there's an everyman that represents us who's willing to ask questions on our behalf. And to also let voices on that aren't typically heard, this is the argument, in the mainstream, which has its own kind of selection bias.
Sure. I mean, gosh, I'm not going to pretend that I've listened to every Joe Rogan podcast episode, but I would say I don't know that like white men with, you know, weird opinions about trans women are like unpopular opinions out there in the world. But I think for me, it's like, I don't even want to talk about the merits of Joe Rogan. I feel like that's so like tangential to like the issues that are at stake here. So I want to respond to a few different things. So one is around this idea of, you know, why certain users flock to Parler and the kind of narrative that Taylor was speaking about around that. And one thing I want to say is that anecdotally, everyone believes that their group is like the most censored group on big tech, right? You can hear that anecdotally, but we don't actually have to live by those anecdotes because we have actual data that shows that the people who are most deplatformed from main big tech social media companies are not conservatives or even leftists. They're Arab and Muslim folks that live outside the United States whose speech are caught in automated anti-terrorism filters. That is the demographic that is most censored on social media right now. People often just posting like a piece of religious text that has been flagged as terrorist propaganda by an automated tool, right? And so I think that that's important because when the narrative becomes these platforms just don't care about hate speech and disinformation, and if they did care, then they would remove more content faster. We're ignoring the fact that when platforms remove more content faster, that doesn't mean they're removing more harmful content faster. That often means they're also removing a lot of legitimate content, and particularly the speech of marginalized people. Right. And so I think, you know, when we talk about deplatforming, it's really important that we recognize which communities have actually experienced it the most. The other community, I would argue, that experiences the most deplatforming within the US is sex workers and folks that are engaged in consensual sex work or engaged in some form of consensual sex work online. Right. So I just think that that's important because, again, I think we just need to have a more thoughtful conversation about, you know, what is needed, what remedies there are. And, you know, you asked about this, and I think we focus too much, from my perspective, on user speech itself. You know, is this piece of content good or bad? Should it be up or should it be down? And I think we don't focus enough on the actual design choices of these companies, right? Facebook, for example, is not just a message board where anyone can say what they want. They are engaging in deep surveillance practices and using the data that they harvest through that surveillance to lift up some content and suppress other content. And they're not doing it in this sort of like Machiavellian, like, well, we like this content and we don't like this content way that everyone seems to think they're doing it in. All they care about is making money. So they're just lifting up whatever content gets the most clicks and the most engagement, and they're suppressing whatever content doesn't get clicks and engagement. And if the content that they're suppressing is really important, they don't really care, right? But unfortunately, I think the narrative has largely focused on only the content that they allow and uplift. And we tend to ignore or downplay the harm that's done by when they suppress content. So just to give an example, there was a coalition of climate justice groups that were pressuring the platforms over climate misinformation that they were amplifying. I think that's important. It's good for them to point that out. But no one seems to care about the fact that if climate science posts are boring, Facebook is actively suppressing them because no one wants to read them or click on them and engage them. And that could be just as damaging to our collective ability to understand the climate crisis as if they're amplifying misinformation about climate, right? So I just think my plea to everyone is care as much about the harm done by suppression as you do by the harm done by amplification. And then the last thing I would say really quick, and I promise I'll give it back, is, I think we focused a lot on, are these boycotts from musicians actually going to affect the bottom line of a company like Spotify? Or we talked about Netflix and Dave Chappelle. And I think that that individualist way of looking at this is often really flawed because the reality is that increasingly we have an internet that is deeply centralized and where the largest platforms are able to engage in anti-competitive practices that make it extremely difficult to create alternatives or for musicians to pull out. I have an album called Spotify is Surveillance that's on Spotify. Because if I didn't put it on Spotify, the vast majority of people who want to listen to queer indie punk music just wouldn't be able to hear it because that's where they listen to music, right? And me making the individual choice to pull my album off of Spotify, it does nothing to affect Spotify, right? I'm not Neil Young. And the vast majority of independent musicians, especially those who've been largely out of work during the pandemic, don't have that privilege to just pull their music or, pull out or go to Amazon, which is, that just makes no sense. Amazon is a deeply unethical company on its own. But so I would say that this is not
that's what Neil Young is kind of
right,
pushing people toward Apple with these incentives.
My guess is, that was just maybe a mistake or unfortunate choice. But what I would say is that this is not an individual problem. It's a collective problem, and it's a problem that needs to be solved with policy. So we have real solutions to this. Things like data privacy legislation that would interrupt those surveillance practices that I was talking about before. The antitrust package that's been sitting around that is hopefully going to start moving in the House that would start chipping away at the dominance of some of these largest platforms and allowing more alternatives like Discord or other forms of things like that where
Parler?
Users have more control.
This is the thing, Evan, because I'm with you, but it does seem like there's some inconsistency between the recognition that there are these antitrust, these monopoly power problems where there aren't alternatives for people to go when they do have an issue with the platform, rightly or wrongly, substantively or non-substantively, and a certain kind of resistance to the idea that some of those platforms might be cannibalized, might be used disproportionately by people who we on the left might not agree with, like Parler. And then there is this
I see
kind
no
of liberal
inconsistency there. I mean,
instinct
from my perspective, that's why we support antitrust, right? I personally don't think that the App Store should be able to boot an app like Parler. I don't think content moderation should happen at the App Store or other infrastructure level. Do I think Discord should be able to say you can't create a Discord that's just for posting non-consensual images of naked people that didn't consent to them being posted? Yeah, because Discord can moderate their own platform, right? So those are two different things. So I actually don't think there's any inconsistency there. I think we want antitrust to allow there to be alternatives. And yes, some of those alternatives will be used by people who I profoundly disagree with. But I think what we want is an internet where users have more choice and control and tools to protect themselves from things like targeted harassment rather than censorship being the only option to deal with online harm.
So to be clear, for people who don't know, when the Parler, at one point when Parler was innovated and Donald Trump was like, everyone's moving to Parler, there was so much traffic to Parler that it was like the most downloaded app in the country. And at that point, Apple, I guess it was, the App Store stops, like put the kibosh on that.
Yeah, both Apple and Google's app stores gave Parler the boot at that juncture. And then I believe Amazon Web Services also gave them the boot at some point. And so those are, and you can look, the Electronic Frontier Foundation has an awesome post about just looking at content moderation in the tech stack. And this gets kind of in the weeds, right? Where we talk about, so folks may remember the fight for net neutrality, right? We're gearing back up into that again. The idea is that at the ISP level, Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, the company that connects you to the internet should not have any right or ability to block you from using certain apps or websites, right? So that's one thing where there's kind of consensus. We all agree on that. You move down from there to the CDN level. That's like Cloudflare, right? Which provides DDoS protection for websites. I would argue that they shouldn't really be doing very much moderation either, that they should just sort of be a neutral service. Then you get down to the App Store level. I would argue that given the level of concentration we have, where if you're not in the Apple and Google App Store, you basically don't exist for the vast majority of mobile users, which disproportionately skews to low-income folks and communities of color. I don't think that a lot of moderation should be happening there. Then you get down to actual apps and services like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I think, I do believe moderation needs to happen in these platforms, but I do think we need to recognize that market power has an influence, right? When people say, oh, it's not a free speech issue, if you get booted off of Facebook because it's a private platform and the First Amendment doesn't apply, they're right from a legal perspective. It's not a First Amendment issue. But if you get booted off of all 5 of the major services, it's really, really hard to get anyone to go to your website or your app or your thing. And so I'm not saying that no one should ever be booted from those services, but I think we should recognize that we have a market concentration problem that does make it a freedom of expression issue if platforms are moderating in a manner that's not consistent with human rights.
Yeah, so this gets us to the substantive issue of what, if anything, should be done here. Freddie, I don't know how closely you've been following kind of the content critique of Joe Rogan's latest episodes and this label of COVID disinformation. But, he had these two people on who are doctors, one of whom I believe is a cardiologist, and one of whom is actually a patent holder of some of the mRNA technology that developed the vaccine. And so he argues, I'm literally, the vaccine wouldn't exist without me, and you guys are invalidating me. Joe Rogan has said that, I certainly don't get it right all the time, and I'm very happy to correct the errors that are made on my show. I don't pretend to be an expert, and I don't have an ideological bit here. I had Sanjay Gupta on. I'm happy to have people from all across the political spectrum on. We just want to be having conversations. And in his response to all of this, has released like a 10-minute video in which he affirms first and foremost that he's a big Neil Young fan, and then goes on to say that he's happy to put the kind of disclaimer label on these episodes that people should consult the CDC or whatever about COVID protocols, or consult their doctors before doing anything that they hear about on the show. And that he's, sorry if he offended anybody, but, it was a pretty gracious response.
I'm a Neil Young fan. I've always been a Neil Young fan. I'll tell you a story at the end of this about that. One of the things that Spotify wants to do that I agree with is that at the beginning of these controversial podcasts, like specifically ones about COVID, is to put a disclaimer and say that you should speak with your physician, and that these people and the opinions that they express are contrary to the opinions of the consensus of experts, which I think is very important. Sure, have that on there. I'm very happy with that. Also, I think if there's anything that I've done that I could do better is have more experts with differing opinions right after I have the controversial ones. I would most certainly be open to doing that.
What do you think about the substantive claim here that Joe Rogan is doing misinformation or disinformation by having these guests on, when, to Joe Rogan's point, there has been no kind of pushback against mainstream sources that have made claims about COVID and what the vaccine can and cannot do that time has proven to be untrue. So, for example, early advice not to wear masks, and then a flip to say we should wear a mask. Early advice that says that cloth masks were very effective, when now we know the efficacy is much less, and on and on and on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that first I'm sort of inclined to give a lot of people more leeway than I ordinarily would for other issues, because a pandemic kind of fell out of the sky on top of all of us. And a lot of people were sort of scrambling to know what to do. I mean, it was literally unprecedented in the history of the world. And so I don't blame some people for sort of trying to dial up the right response to, if you want to call it misinformation or whatever. I think that there's actually a fairly robust debate now about a lot of these elements. To the list that you said, I would say that the biggest issue is like how long it took the public health apparatus to acknowledge that COVID is airborne and not just aerosol, which to me is like more a story about like medical bureaucracy than about misinformation. And I also think that, you should always look for these material connections. So like, I think a big part of vaccine hesitancy is the fact that our medical system is an absolute mess, A lot of people don't just have a doctor, you know what I'm saying? And so they don't have they're not in a position of trust and closeness with medical providers. And so it's not something that is interfacing with their lives on a regular basis, where they can go to a doctor who has time to talk to them and say, hey, there's these new vaccines. I know it's a little scary, but here's some of the facts about them, right? I am insured, and in the last year I've become affluent, and yet getting healthcare in New York, which is some of the most healthcare providers in the world, is a nightmare. I mean, I tore my rotator cuff last year. It took me 3 months before I was actually in a physical therapist's office because our system is so fucked up. I had 2 orthopedist appointments. I totaled 6 minutes of talking to the orthopedist in those 2 appointments, even though I had lots of questions, because he ran into the room and ran out, right? So that's another thing. But there's a bigger part of this thing, which is just, I think a lot of the lament about misinformation or extremism or whatever, a lot of this stuff boils down to the fact that a lot of people in the world are dumbasses, and that can't be fixed with policy. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, at a certain point, like, you have to just sort of conclude, okay, go get this free shot and it can save your life, or you could die from this thing. And people say, not me, I'm not doing it. And like that, like there is a certain level to which
you really think that's true.
I think that you can engineer policy solutions to the best of your ability, but there is a certain portion of the population who is always going to find a way to shoot themselves in the dick. And I don't think that I think that like people say, oh, but only 85% of eligible Americans are vaccinated. I'm like, only, like that's actually sounds really good to me compared to just knowing, like, again, like I believe that they're trapped in systems often, like I said, that compel them to feel a lack of trust. But at the center of all of it, right, you have people who have to make the determination. Is it actually possible that Hillary Clinton was going into the basement of a pizza restaurant to molest children and then eat their souls or whatever?
The kinds of arguments that are being made now are a very different quality than Pizzagate. Certainly, there are some outlier claims being made about COVID, but I think that the attitude that everybody who is vaccine hesitant, that label vaccine hesitancy in and of itself, I think, is a part of the problem. Because one of the points that's being made is that that term is being treated with as such a wide umbrella that conversations about vaccine hesitancy that are even geared toward helping people be less hesitant by taking on their concerns head on and talking about them with experts are liable to get you banned on an app or demonetized or suppressed. And so now you have these winnowing holes. So you talked to Taylor about Discord. I'll go to you next, about where people are able to create their own small communities. But I think part of the problem is that censorship, or whatever you want to call it, is in fact driving people into more and more segregated media holes where you do have one camp of people just assuming the other camp of people are histrionic idiots because there's never an opportunity for two opposing sides to talk to each other about what they actually believe and have misinformation corrected where it needs to be corrected. Yeah, go ahead, Taylor.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in. I mean, this is something I think about a lot as somebody that has sort of chronic illness and spends a lot of time in these types of communities that, there's things that are certainly fringe in terms of medically, like, what's going around in these places. And that goes back to what Freddie's saying about lack of access to medical care, right? And I totally agree as well that, like, the way that people speak about, like, those who don't get vaccinated or whatever is usually very, like, othering in this not helpful way. But I think the sort of extra layer to consider on all of this is, these conversations are happening on social platforms or in media environments where, like, people are incentivized to kind of generate their own audience. And there are these people who kind of, like, the people that Joe Rogan had on, as I understand, like, from sort of following them a little bit, like, they're definitely, like, this is their thing, and I think there's a lot of people and a lot of, bad actors that will come into communities that are very rightfully, like, looking to actually get reliable medical information or have very real concerns about vaccinations or whatever. And they're overtaken by these kind of, like, influencers that have their whole personality is kind of sowing doubt. And so I just wonder if I think, like, the thing here with Rogan is because of the nature of his show, and I've listened to his show for years, like you said, he's asking these questions, but I do wish that he did a little bit of his more research in terms of the guests that he brought on. I wonder if there's people that could have spoken to those same concerns that he might have and others might have in a more productive way, instead of just, like, using it as their kind of, like, influencer platform to, like, stay the same shtick that they're saying everywhere else. That, I don't know.
So in that 10-minute clip, he says, I think that the criticism that I've gotten that I should have the opposing view interview follow up more quickly when I have a controversial interview like the ones that I've done, I should have them closer back to back is a right criticism. And that I should just have quicker follow-up and be more prepared. But he also says,
I do all the scheduling myself, and I don't always get it right. These podcasts are very strange because they're just conversations. And oftentimes I have no idea what I'm going to talk about until I sit down and talk to people. And that's why some of my ideas are not that prepared or fleshed out, because I'm literally having them in real time.
Which I got to say, as a content creator, is kind of relatable. People accuse me all the time. Oh, why did you put this behind a paywall? And I'm like, they're coming out as they're coming out. And I'm just like a duck paddling underwater. You know what I mean? And you can say that, okay, that is irresponsible and he just shouldn't be on the air unless he's able to be prepared on a certain level. But I would say two things to that. One, nobody's holding professional media to those kinds of standards. Professional media get things wrong all the time. W&D is anyone, and there's no accountability there whatsoever. And they're often unwilling to be honest about their mistakes and make corrections with the alacrity that I will say Joe Rogan has managed to make. So what are we saying here? Are we saying that someone like Joe Rogan in these kind of informal media outlets just shouldn't exist because they don't have like a fact-checking department?
Well, can I just say something too?
Sure.
Having worked in the media, I totally agree with you. I think that the media, does not, especially traditional media, which I've worked in and I love and feel is important. You're right. Like they've lost a lot of trust in so many ways because of their inability to have those conversations and admit, when they do make an error, in a way. But I think and I don't think every content creator needs a whole fact checking department either. But I think if you're going to invite someone on that is basically built a career as an influencer purporting a certain message, you should be prepared for that or be prepared for the backlash and anticipate that type of backlash. I also don't know that the solution is to be like, well, here's what one people say, here's what other people say, right? Like, who knows? I think hopefully you would be able to sort of suss that out before you have people on. But I don't know. I just basically wish that he did a little bit more preparation or kind of anticipated the fact that these people are using his platform to kind of spin him, and they're clearly spinning him. And I think, that's a problem with anyone that's I don't know if I'm making sense. That has not.
It's not an easy question. There are people who said, they heard I was going to have Andrew Sullivan on the show and they say, oh my God, why would you platform Andrew Sullivan? Right. My view is Andrew Sullivan has a platform that's so much bigger than my own, including, by the way, for years in traditional media. Right. And I felt like I had a personal obligation to be prepared to read what he's written, to be familiar with his arguments and be ready to rebut. But there's always the chance that he could have bested me in that interview and I could have been spreading whatever, race science or whatever people's critique of him is. And I would have been in a similar situation ready to be critiqued as Dave Chappelle. Now, felt comfortable inviting Andrew Sullivan on because I feel comfortable talking about the subjects that he talks and writes about. I might not have as much comfort level having someone on to talk about, Uyghur genocide or something, which is why I have not as of yet had an episode about China. Do you know what I mean? Because I have to be prepared and I also have to have guests on that can challenge each other. And that's part of what I'm hoping to do with this panel here. Because I got to say, the tone that is taken by, I think, the predominant kind of liberal media about Joe Rogan doesn't quite sit right with me because it does seem to be out of step with what is actually said and done on the show, even if there are aspects of it that one can critique. And it strikes me as continuing to drive the level of distrust in mainstream media when the mainstream media takes this position that paints Joe Rogan as, I think, he's a flawed character, but not quite as ideological as zealot as people make him out to be. What do you think, Evan? And I know that, by the way, that you have to go sooner or later. So if you want to sum up, also want to make your exit on this comment, you're more than welcome to.
Okay, sure. I will strut off into the distance at the end of this. But no, I think that, just to touch on the previous point, with power comes responsibility, right? And so the larger your platform gets, the more thoughtful I think everyone ideally would or should be with how they use it. And I think it's also, there's, what Neil Young did is free speech too, right? He is using his platform to say something that he believes in. And what is that if not righteous, right? But what I would say, though, is I do feel that people perhaps are misplacing some of their anger or perhaps misrecognizing where power really lies, right? I would argue, Joe Rogan having what I would agree is misinformation on his podcast. I think it's hard to measure what the actual impact of that on vaccine hesitancy is. But we do know that, for example, there are policies in place that the US government is pushing right now that is making it much, much harder for millions of people around the world who want to get vaccinated, who don't have access to vaccines, right? So if people are really outraged about people not being vaccinated, one thing they could do is push for a waiver to intellectual property restrictions to make it easier for people to get access to the vaccine. Another thing they could do is push for the Biden administration to stop blocking this potential for the Walter Reed developed vaccine to be made available to the world, right? So there are things, I think sometimes we feel powerless in the face of these big institutions like governments. And so we direct our anger at something that feels smaller or something that's a bit more culture war. And that's not necessarily wrong. But I would just argue, for me as an activist, I want to prioritize my attention on, going after the folks that really have power, and trying to get them to use that power productively, to make the world a better place. So I'll close with that, that I think, it's not wrong to be mad, but, it's where you direct your anger, and are you channeling it in a productive manner?
Well, Evan, I appreciate you centering us there. I'm going to keep the other two on for a little longer if you guys can. But Evan, can you let our audience know where to find you and your work?
Yeah, sure. So again, my name's Evan Greer. I'm a queer indie punk musician, and I'm also the director of a digital rights nonprofit called Fight for the Future. And you can find me on Twitter at Evan_Greer, or search for me on all of the various websites, including Spotify, I guess.
Thank you for that, Evan. So Freddie, let me come back to you.
Yeah.
I gotta confess, I was hoping to have more of a substantive conversation about the merits of these claims that what Rogan is doing is disinformation. Because I do think that part of why I feel so unsettled here is because we are accepting as a premise that what happens on his show is categorically different than what happens when, for example, and this is an example I like to talk about a lot, on March 15th of 2020, the day of the last Democratic primary debate, a day that the CDC came out with new guidance saying that people should not congregate in rooms of more than 50 or more. Joe Biden's then press secretary, Simone Sanders, gets on TV and says it's completely safe to vote. The CDC says it's safe to vote. Everybody go and vote. And in much of the country, that would mean going and congregating in a room of 50 people or more.
Our democracy is extremely important. And even in times of strife in this country, we have to do our duty. So the CDC and folks have said it's safe out there for Tuesday. So I don't know what Senator Sanders was talking about, but I'll tell you, Governor DeWine said it was safe in Ohio. So I encourage people to get out there and vote on Tuesday.
And at no point is there any kind of moment of acknowledgement about the push and the political incentives that were behind so much of the discourse around COVID, especially in the early days of the COVID, when Democratic establishment players had a great deal of incentive in wrapping up the primary and framing the risk around COVID consequently in terms that would enable them to do so. So why is it that now, this is not that, I have strong feelings one way or the other about what Joe Rogan says, but it does strike me when I listen to the episode with Dr. Robert, the virologist, the guy who did the mRNA research, as not so transparently different than what you have heard in terms of the pivoting that has come from even the CDC and Dr. Fauci.
I should be clear, if I wasn't articulate before, I'm not a big one for the term misinformation or disinformation. I don't think that there's a non-ideology laden way to sort of define those things. Like I said, I think that just pragmatically, if Spotify folds on this, Rogan comes back stronger. Right. So it's as a pragmatic conversation, it's not that big of a deal for him. But I also think the point that I was trying to make before is just I'm a big believer in the idea that you can't save people from themselves. Okay, I believe in good government, and I believe in good messaging, and I believe in good politics. But when we have this long conversation about, okay, Facebook made my aunt racist, right? We can and we do have long drawn out conversations about what that means Facebook's responsibility is. But at the core of that problem is nothing to do with Facebook. The core of that problem is your aunt is someone who can be made racist by Facebook.
Freddie, that is so deterministic and I don't know.
No, it's the opposite. It's the opposite of deterministic, right? What I'm saying is that the talking head class, us, right, tend to talk about a lot of people as if we can just sort of lay out all the right incentives and they will then believe the right things, right? Part of the point I'm trying to say here is there was never a world in which we had a perfect vaccine acceptance rate in which the entirety of the United States had the right response and wanted to get vaccinated, right? In other words, it is the wonk dream that you can engineer the country in such a way that they will do and say and think.
But Freddie,
the right
there are
things.
other countries that certainly have a higher rate of, vaccine compliance than we do.
That's true. We're also the country that invented having to put "do not reuse" as a beverage container on old bleach bottles, right? There's
okay, but Freddie, so you think that Americans are just constitutionally moronic?
No, I think that there is something. I think that there's such a oppositional psychology baked into the American psyche, right? That I don't want to do it because fuck you. That's why. I think that is part of our national endowment. And maybe we could have gotten to 90% of eligible people vaccinated, maybe. But like, I think that these conversations tend to happen in the shadow of a belief in a 100% vaccinated United States that I don't think was ever feasibly possible, right?
But Freddie, I wouldn't even, the kinds of conversations just for flavor that people are having in these episodes that are people are concerned about aren't like don't get vaxxed conversations. They are more on the lines of why aren't more people talking about X or Y study that is talking about myocarditis as a consequence of vaccination, or delayed menses that many people have experienced after getting their COVID vaccines. And, is it suspicious that those aren't more fulsomely, discussed in a more fulsome way in the mainstream? I might not be suspicious. It might just be a consequence of COVID. It's not a vaccine. It's not something that would prevent me from getting vaccinated, because obviously the consequences of getting COVID as a unvaccinated person are much higher. There's a significant likelihood of death. But the fact that these are not conversations that are being had, and the fact that I'm now being threatened with deplatforming for having these conversations suggests to the paranoid mind, or to the skeptical mind, the rightly skeptical mind, that there's something more afoot. And to your point, Freddie, if we live in a country that is so contrarian, where people, have this, well, if you told me to do it, I don't want to do it attitude, then isn't stigmatizing, Rogan and other interlocutors like him completely counterintuitive? Frankly, listening to that doctor episode of Rogan made me like, oh, let me Google some of this stuff. And that is like both frightening and like weirdly provocative. I don't know.
Well, but look, I agree with you, right? I totally agree with you. But I think part of the point is that, like, if Rogan can be vaccinated and say publicly that he's vaccinated and not be intending to have an anti-vax show, and yet there is this powerful narrative that people are becoming anti-vax because of Joe Rogan's show, right? It implies to me that, like, again, people are just looking for an excuse not to get vaccinated. You know what I'm saying? Like,
but who's creating the narrative that Joe Rogan is an anti-vax show? It's the mainstream media outlet. It's certainly not Joe Rogan saying I have an anti-vax show. He's very clear that is not his personal position.
Yeah, I agree. Look, I don't think he should be kicked off Spotify, but I do think that, like, at some point, you have to look at these problems. They have filtered through the perspective of, look what social media is doing to people. And at some point, you have to respect those people sufficiently to say, these are adult human beings. And if some trucker meme can make your grandma into a racist and a conspiracy theorist, right? Really respecting that person means, okay, probably the trucker meme didn't really do it, right? And there are deeper problems in the American experience right now that compels people to be conspiracy theorists. Just the sheer amount of absolutely batshit conspiracy theorizing going on right now is staggering to me and very frightening. And that's like a deeper thing, right? Like the vaccine
What is that deeper
stuff,
thing?
I don't know. I think that there is a collapse in belief of any kind of like shared American public project, that the partisan divide and the sort of college educated and not divide, the has and have not divides, all these divides are sort of creating a sense in which everyone believes that they are the sworn enemy of the person next to them in the grocery store, and that it is undermining really basic fundamental parts of like social cohesion and fabric that make it impossible to have the level of social trust where you say, okay, yeah, I trust not my government, not Fauci, not the CDC, but I trust like the American sort of community. We're all going to go and get vaccinated together and all go do it. I don't know that it's possible for people to have that feeling anymore.
I'm going to say, go ahead, Taylor.
I was just going to say, Freddie's going full doomer, like kind of, and I get it. I get it. I really do. I think obviously we live in a super sort of broken society in so many ways. To me, and maybe this is just through the lens of what I cover, I think a lot of us are just, a lot of people are trying to struggle and find their footing in this new media environment. I think rightfully, the legacy media companies, people are realizing these flaws in the way that sort of we had gotten our information for years. And there's not necessarily like the greatest sense of how to vet information that they find on the internet. Like, we don't have a ton of media literacy. I spend a ton of time on TikTok, and there is no there's no questioning of anything on TikTok. I mean, people just see a TikTok and it is like, you go to the comments, people believe it in a way that I think people don't even on Twitter. So I think there's like problems to be worked out. I kind of agree with Freddie in some sense that a lot of these problems are things that are on the structural level. We can't squash one platform and expect this to change. We cannot kick certain influencers off somewhere and expect this to change. I think we as a society need to better understand media literacy and push our institutions for more accountability when they do get stuff wrong. I mean, also, I think like long COVID, for instance, is something that has been so ignored in the media that is clearly, you know, a huge thing. And I think that spending time in sort of chronic illness communities, so many people that are anti-vax or were very pro-vax, but become radicalized because they see, wait a minute, right? Like the media is actually not reporting certain things. And suddenly I'm questioning everything. And there's no one to really walk them through that and help them kind of get their sea legs in this new media climate.
Yeah, there is no one. You know, Freddie just referenced this idea that we should, you know, there's not going to be an America where we all link arms and run down to the vaccination center and get vaccinated together. I don't know that I subscribe to that America. I don't know that I want to link arms and like, you know, frog march down to the vaccination center. There is something, I'm a naturally skeptical person. And, you know, I got vaccinated because I was planning a trip to see my grandmother. You know, I see the risk of hospitalization for unvaccinated people who get COVID. I'm fairly isolated, but I'm like, oh, well, I'm not going to travel and then expose my vulnerable people to this. And as a sense of community, I did it. But there is enough floating around in the ether. You know, I, you know, have a mild heart irregularity. Like some of the stuff that gets thrown out there about the side effects of COVID, which might not affect one people, give me some pause. And in a world where, you know, in a perfect world for me, there would be more robust conversation about how individuals can assess their own risk reward matrix that doesn't presume that more information equals COVID hesitancy in quotation marks, which is basically anti-vaxxer. Like, I think that probably a huge numbers of Americans are vaccine hesitant insofar as like no one, like a lot of people don't love the idea of getting vaccinated, don't trust the pharmaceutical industry, have Tuskegee and other moments in the back of their head, and have, I think, a very healthy and normal anxiety about something like this. And yet any articulation of that gets flattened in a way that I think makes, charlatans and grifters more able to do their grift.
I think that there's a good chance that if Trump is reelected in 2020, that it's still about 85% of people are vaccinated, but the holdouts are now on the left rather than on the right. And
look at what Kamala said.
Yeah.
When Kamala was asked during the primary whether or not she would take the vaccine if Trump came out with it, she was like, I don't know, maybe we got to double check everything that Trump does, you know?
I just think this goes back to these fundamental issues, right? We need to fix these root problems like in our healthcare system and in society where Americans can actually see a doctor that they trust, you know, and talk about the side effects of things. Because I think everyone is sort of expected to just make their own decisions in this information stew. And then you're sort of attacked, you know, a lot of times when you don't maybe know what you're talking about. And so I think that these are like root issues that are deeper than just the platforms. And I wish that the platforms could do more to kind of help facilitate productive conversations. Like I said, I spend a lot of time in these chronic illness communities that are desperate for recognition from the medical establishment and have been so maligned.
So what do you think should be done? Because we talked a lot about how Joe Rogan is in a typical case here because he is being paid $100 million to be exclusively hosted on Spotify. He gave up his RSS feed, which is the, mechanism by which podcasters like put their stuff out in the world and then it gets funneled to all these different platforms. You know, your subscriber base is to your RSS feed. So, you know, that's a risk reward there he's setting up there by going exclusively to Spotify. But the point being that this isn't really a content moderation issue. This is like a choosing not to go be a co-performing or at a concert issue or whatever, and you're right to pull out.
I think it's an editorial issue.
An editorial issue. Well put. Thank you. So what if anything should be done? If we took for a second and just presumed that Rogan or someone like Rogan were doing something actually bad, like actually harmful, and perhaps illegal. Let's not use Rogan as an example because that is not necessarily what's happening, but let's call it, podcaster X. What should happen in this scenario? Do we want it just to be the case that every artist on Spotify has to threaten to withdraw to get any justice done? Do we think Spotify should promulgate standards that would cause them to have to boot Dr. X? Sorry, podcaster X.
I mean, I think if Joe Rogan was going on his show and saying, the Jews are poisoning your children or whatever, then yeah, Spotify should just pull his show, knowing that he will be able to find other venues to do it, even if it is like, the extremely sketch, Russian web hosting, whatever. He'll find somewhere to do it. But that's not, at some point, there is a certain injury to sort of the basic public good that you just have to do it, even if the effects are not going to solve the problem. I mean, look, I just think that like, these issues, part of what animates these issues is that as soon as something is aligned in a culture war frame, you are ensuring that people will push back as hard as they possibly can, right? As soon as the vaccine became seen through a culture war frame, you had a big group of conservatives who said never, right? Because they came to believe that it's what the pointy heads in, New York and DC wanted them to do, right? The problem is like, it's not like Fauci was going out there saying like, all you good liberals should take your vaccine. Under the current conditions of the country, it's hard for me to understand how any major issue crops up that doesn't get sort of pushed into a cultural war frame.
But let's reflect on how that happened, though, because remember, Fauci was there under Trump. Yeah. And
I mean, look, I'm here in Park Slope, right? And it's an affluent neighborhood in Brooklyn. And a few years ago, there was a big measles outbreak. And of course, measles is a solved problem, except that there's a lot of people here who went anti-vax because Gwyneth Paltrow told them to, right?
Yeah, it's California has that issue all the time. It's right. Like a woo-woo lefty kind of a thing historically.
And so like, one of the things that happens is that people sort of see these issues as, am I aligning myself with Gwyneth Paltrow or with Alex Jones, right? In other words, people find the culture war frame, ask themselves what side of the culture war they stand on, and that sort of directs them in one direction or the other. And again, like, it is so deeply integrated into the basic economics of media, into the basic economics of these platforms culture war is great for Facebook's bottom line. And it's so deeply rooted in our culture now. It's hard for me to think of ways in which to say the next pandemic. Okay, how do we make it so conservatives don't see this as necessarily a conspiracy against them? And I don't have a good answer for that question.
Or liberals, if it is the case that Trump, there have been these funny moments where Trump has kind of tried to own the vaccine, like his ego takes precedence over knowing what his fan base likes. And he says, well, this is my vaccine. I developed it.
You know what? I believe totally in your freedoms. I do. Brie, you got to do what you have to do. But I recommend take the vaccines. I did it. It's good. Take the vaccines. But no, that's okay. That's all right. You got your freedoms.
And so I can imagine a world where Trump is back in office and maybe he can hit that landing better in the pendulum switches. I can imagine a world where Trump won in 2020 and we would be having a very different conversation about the valence of vaccine hesitancy. It's not hard for me to believe, which is why I'm really struggling here, I guess, to come up with metrics that are not ideological and aren't rooted in a distaste for some of Rogan's guests or some of his past statements on trans issues or, all of the reasons, good and bad, for people not to like him, and that are more neutral, metrics that are more neutral. And Taylor, you're someone who, writes about these kinds of issues for a living and has also kind of personally been critiqued by some of the big names in this space for, their perception that you are kind of like harder on the conservative platforms like Parler in a way that
I've never said anything about Parler, just to be clear.
So I'm for sure. So like, but the critique, the critique that you.
Yeah. I mean, I know what the critiques, and they love to say I'm cancel culture and I'm anti-free speech. I think anyone that even has remotely spoken to me once or actually follows my work would not make those critiques.
So what would you say to that? I want to give you a chance to address them.
I just think I think it's very easy, especially when you're at a place like the New York Times, it's this hyper politicized place, to paint me as, this mainstream media person trying to silence us or whatever. My entire beat, the premise of my entire beat is literally like validating sort of online creators and the work that happens on the internet and talking about these really important shifts in the digital media ecosystem that I have always championed. I truly believe that our media climate today, as broken as it is better than it was in the 90s, because we have more voices and because there can be dissent and there can be conversation. And I would, as a journalist, free speech is critical to us doing our jobs every day. I would never, I'm not out there saying anything. That at the same time, I think that these are problems that we're, as a society, I certainly don't have the answer to kind of where to draw these boundaries. I think Rogan is kind of this normie example of a lot of stuff that's happening. I'm a listener to Logan Paul's Impulsive podcast. And, I know people have had so many issues with Logan over the years. And I think that a lot of this stuff that we're seeing in terms of people being angry about Rogan, we're going to see, they don't even realize what's behind him. Rogan is pretty normie, compared to a lot of YouTubers that have massive audiences and are certainly going to start getting bigger deals. So I don't know. I just kind of am thinking out loud, but
Well, I've kept you guys here for an hour. And so I want to sum up by asking you about, I think, some breaking news that a lot of people are concerned about when it comes to, media monopolies and, free speech and all of these issues. Wordle has just been bought by the New York Times, the popular daily, once-a-day word game that has taken the world by storm. And people are reacting in a way that suggests, they seem to believe that this is somehow going to undermine the access to the game or the spirit of the game being kind of free and out there in the world. What do you guys think?
Because I'm well known to be a cranky hater, people will often try to recruit me into hating things, and my readers kept asking me to hate on Wordle, and I had to include in a post. I was like, the existence of this game costs me nothing. Why on earth would I care about it? I do think, I've never played it. It's just not my style. I think that people are not seeing it will be nurtured at the Times better than it could be nurtured anywhere else, because the Times already has a dedicated game space, right? It's got the crossword section and that stuff where, yes, of course, the initial big, huge viral sensation part of it will die off over time, but it'll be much better able to sort of live on at the Times than if it had been bought by Yahoo or someone,
But what if it weren't bought at all?
Well, then the creator would be out $1 million+, and I think you probably would have something to say about that.
So the Times has said it's not going to paywall Wordle. What do you make of it all, Taylor?
Yeah, I doubt that they'll paywall it. The Times has a pretty robust gaming strategy. I actually think it was inevitable Wordle was going to get bought. I think anything successful online, people want to co-opt it, right? People want to figure out that monetization path. I personally, I'm not a Wordle hater at all. I'm just bad at it. And so I think it'll be like any of these other viral games. I don't know that it'll be around forever, but
why do you think you're bad at it, Taylor?
I'm so dyslexic. I can barely spell, my own name. So I'm always where was the I? I don't know.
I'm a little bit like that too. The other day, people were really mad because the final word was a word that has a lot of words that are identical to it, but with a different first letter. And a lot of people were striking out because they were guessing. They got the last four words in 2 or 3 tries, but then struck out anyway because there's just a lot of good options for that first letter. And it was I think the word was maybe sight or light. It was light. And I put height spelled wrong and it accepted it. Apparently HIGHT is a word, or whatever it is a word.
Yeah.
And I feel like I was getting punished for both being a bad speller, but apparently also just guessing at words that existed. I don't know. So I will hate on Wordle a little bit. I think the point that you both make about it being kind of inevitably bought up is an interesting one. But I would have liked to have seen if the inventor of Wordle had crowdsourced a campaign to keep Wordle free, if he could have gotten enough donations to a Patreon or what's the one that everyone uses for their health care?
GoFundMe.
GoFundMe.
Oh, yeah.
To at least match or beat the price that the New York Times was offering. Could there be a Wordle bidding war that the public could participate in to keep Wordle free?
Yeah, I want to know where all the crypto people are. Like, their whole thing is like NFTs, you know, Web3, like, keep it all independent. And it's like, okay, so let's, you know, where was the Wordle NFT? I don't know.
Where was the Wordle NFT? We're going to have to get some experts in to discuss. I want to thank you both for joining us for this spirited conversation on bad faith today. Taylor, can you let people know where to find you in your work?
Yeah, definitely. You can find me on literally every platform. I'm at Taylor Lorenz. So Twitter, Instagram, taylorlorenz.substack.
Do you have a TikTok account? Do you TikTok?
I have over 500,000 followers on TikTok.
Oh my God. You're going to have to tell me your secrets. I'm going to have a TikTok tutorial with you later because I feel like I've aged out and I need to get on the stick.
You need to, I'm telling you, we need to get more like smart people on there. It's like chaos right now. It's being run by 9-year-olds and the discourse on there is something else. Didn't
it used to be the case that you had to be like 13 to use the internet? That you had to sign off all these things? Yeah.
Theoretically, I think I don't know how much that's enforced, to be honest. Certainly not.
Internet. I mean, we could do a whole other episode about youth and the internet. But Freddie, let people know where they can find you and your fabulous Substack, where you've written a piece about how folks are trying to get you to hate on things and you are refusing to do so.
And I can't do it. I'm at freddydeboer.substack.com, which is also available to be purchased by the New York Times or anyone else for low 7 figures. And I have 12 followers on Untapped, the beer-focused social network. So find me on there.
Well, thank you for that. This is a free episode, but if you want to support Bad Faith Podcast, different kind of independent media, you can subscribe for an additional episode every week that comes out on Mondays at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. You can also help us out and help us beat that Facebook algorithm by going over and subscribing to Bad Faith YouTube. We've had some nice little growth in subscribers this month, and I would like to keep that going. We are woefully undersubscribed over there, and we put out beautiful video content for you. Thank you to our listeners. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.